Hello and welcome to asiCast episode 181. I'm Richard Marks, ASI's Research Director, and joining me today is George Ivey, who's Chief Exec of the Media Rating Council. So, hello, George.
Hi, Richard. Good to see you again. Man, you've had a
Now,
lot of podcasts. 180. The last podcast I was on was like 140 something.
142. We're flattered that you were that close. You remember what number you were. Yeah. Now, in a recent podcast, more recent than 142, we discussed with a panel of experts the future of measurement and specifically the evolving role of transparency, auditing, and standards. And whilst the MRC was not the main focus of that discussion, it did actually crop up more than we expected. And I know that George is keen to expand further on that role, what it does and does not do, and also address some of the perspectives that were expressed. So you mentioned podcast 142, and we did discuss the broad history and the role of the MRC in depth with you back in that podcast, but it was 3 years ago. So for any new listeners to the podcast, it might be worth starting with just a very quick reminder for listeners of what the MRC does, and I guess equally important, what it doesn't do.
Sure, and thank you for having me, Richard. I appreciate it. Well, the MRC uh, really does two things. We're a kind of a simple organization. We set standards for how media is measured, and we have a big business cycle to do that. Um, And the second thing we do is we conduct audits, very rigorous audits of organizations that measure media to determine whether they're in compliance with our standards. And when they're in compliance with our standards, we award them MRC accreditation. And we call that accreditation because it's a form of industry self-regulation where our members of the members of the MRC get involved in that process. They get on audit committees, participate in audit reviews, and help us go through the process of evaluating and awarding accreditation. But those are our two main functions. We uh, we audit research of all kinds. We used to just audit, for example, television and radio research, and this was back in the 60s when we were formed. But since then, we've expanded our role, really auditing all kinds of media measurement, and the standards have grown accordingly. Like over the last 20 years, we've set a lot of digital standards on how you measure. And now we've moved into things like cross media standards and outcome standards, and we're working right now on an auction transparency standard and things like that. So that's basically what we do. What we do not do, we don't sell anything. We don't hold conferences. We don't really seek publicity. And we don't audit custom research. So, like if you're a customer and you want kind of like an individual snowflake study of something, that's not what MRC audits. We audit what we call syndicated kind of research, where it's a fixed kind of a process that measures. You could even say most people don't consider it syndicated, but for example, ad serving is like a syndicated measurement process because it happens the same all the time, all the way up to, let's say, I measure television with big data or a panel or something. Those are routinized processes. That's the kind of thing we audit.
Hmm.
So that's basically a thumbnail of what we do, Richard.
So you mentioned the two main functions, which is conducting audits and setting standards. And I guess outside of the US, it's the latter that's had the most focus over the last few years, particularly with, for example, you just referenced it, the MRC cross-platform video standards on viewability and duration. I mean, how would you react to some of the controversy those standards have met in some quarters, particularly, I guess, amongst broadcasters? Are they misunderstanding what those standards are about? I guess it's almost like an existential question of the degree to which they are rules versus guidelines and US guidelines versus international guidelines.
Yeah, that's a complex question, so might take me a couple minutes to answer that.
Go
Richard.
for it. Go for it.
So first of all, I'm actually not sure, Richard, the standard is as controversial as you may think it is. First of all, even among broadcasters, we have many broadcasters that we know, for example, support the duration weighting component of the standard in a strong way. You know, Barb in the UK, Médiamétrie in France. We know Barb has been vocal publicly in support of our standard, and Médiamétrie has been likewise. We work with those organizations directly. In fact, Barb is a member of MRC. And one of the reasons why they participate with us is because they get a much more granular view and access to us in terms of standard interpretation. What the standard does, and bear with me for a moment, like imagine we're wading into a very controversial area. We have legacy video measurement, which has been measured in certain ways in the past with panels and now incorporating big data and things like that. Um, and then on the other side of the house, you have some pretty powerful enterprises like platforms, Google, Meta, Amazon, TikTok, that have measurement functions that are focused on granular ad serving, impression measurement at that level. And the standard wades into that debate and tries to create a method to fairly measure those two sides of the house. And what I'm afraid happens a lot is that people mistake controversy about that tension for controversy about the standards and rules we provide. So if you hear arguments like, oh, well, Google and Meta and Amazon were too involved in creating the vid model, and television wasn't evolved enough in that, involved enough in that. Well, that has nothing to do with the standard or standard fairness. That's more of a political orientation in marketplace control and marketplace influence. Or if somebody says, well, the standard is going to require, distributed data processing, and where do those nodes reside? Does Google run one of those, or do the broadcasters run one of those? That's not about standards. That's about sort of influence within the process. So what I've heard about controversy is people still misunderstand the meaning of a viewable impression in this context. I'll hear a broadcaster from time to time say, why should I pin my measurement to a viewable impression which is measured over a 2 second interval? That's not what we do in broadcast. Well, that's a fundamental misunderstanding of our requirement. So there's also this level. Like, think about a meter, Richard. Like, there's a moment that triggers meter measurement. Either they get a code, or they get a signature, or there's power or something. We've seen all kinds of meters. That's what a viewable impression is. It's the moment when measurement can be initiated. The standard then says you append duration measurement. There's duration weighted measurement that can be appended. You can report the facts and circumstances around the content being measured. Is it produced content? Is it user generated content? So there's in no way us saying, well, a viewable impression is the only thing that's relevant here, and we're going to hold everybody to viewable impression. No, we're moving it towards fully informed measurement around the circumstances of the viewing of that video. So there's a lot of controversy, but I'm afraid some of it is kind of misallocated to our standard and it's more politics. And then I've heard some controversies about things like a viewable impression, and that actually is not considering all the components of the standard that are embedded into it. That otherwise we've seen a lot of acceptance of the standard. In the UK they're using it, in the US Aquila is using it, you know, Nielsen's using it for Nielsen One. There's all kinds of adoption of this standard. It doesn't feel as controversial to me.
Mm. I mean, it's interesting because you mentioned politics, and I guess there's another slight elephant in the room, which is the US versus the rest of the world angle. Because I mean, the two projects you mention, Origin and Aquila in the UK and the US, are obviously heavily backed by WFA. and obviously involve Google and Facebook. But I do wonder if there is an element of uh, nationalism, patriotism, whatever it is, that the feeling that somehow these US standards are being imposed on countries, that they're not invented here element of things. And I take the point that you have got entities like Barb and Medimetry involved, and I think some other JICs are involved with the MRC. But what feeling of ownership is there? Because I mean, what actual entity is the MRC? You've got Barb on, has joined the MRC, but are they a co-owner of it? Who is it? Still a US company operating abroad, or is there any way in which the governance of it can be made to feel less of a US export and more of something that the international community feels they own? It's a long question, but I guess the point I'm getting across is that
So
I sometimes wonder whether some of the pushback against the MRC is because of this feeling that it's somehow been exported along with Google and Facebook and the WFA North Star, and is sort of not made here, for want of a better phrase.
I it's so first of all, Richard, a very, very insightful question. I'm super glad you asked it. I don't know that I have a perfect answer for it, but let me explain the lay of the land to you from our perspective. The MRC is a US organization, period, full stop. We were set up at the request of the US Congress. We were given permission to do what we do in the US, and we were even given special permission to do what we do through reviews by the US Department of Justice to protect us from US antitrust regulations. As long as we stick to our mission and we feel some responsibility towards the Department of Justice today to maintain that structure. We don't operate outside the US in any functional manner. We write standards and we do our best to write standards, and we cast a net for the working groups to write standards, which is inclusive of anybody in the world. So uh, if you work at a research company, if you work at a media company, if you work at a consulting firm, if you don't even have a job, you can participate on an MRC standards working group. And we have a ton of people from outside the US that participate on MRC standards working groups, not just our members. It's free to anyone. So, but when the standards are written, they're branded MRC and they're used in the US. We have organizations, we run a voluntary process to seek accreditation and compliance with the standards. And we have organizations that come to us from outside the US and say, we want to be noted as in compliance with your standard. Will you audit us? And in general, we will. We have to have a good assessment body to evaluate that. For example, we recently formed a European Audit Committee made up of our members, but members like Nestle, Mars, AGF, Auditel, Sim Belgium, Barb, ECTA, TF1, SBT, RTL, company SBT is a broadcaster in Brazil. So, we have a European audit committee that's volunteers from our membership that are very interested in European measurement that'll work on and help us assess audits. So we don't we don't seek jurisdiction outside the US. People come to us and volunteer for audits using the standards we produce. We also don't force anybody to comply with our standards. We don't go to the UK or UK regulators or Barb or anybody else with authority in the UK and say, well, you should you should comply with our impression measurement standard. We write it. We think it's a smart standard. If somebody from outside the US wants to use it, they can. We don't collect royalties or anything. We don't do that. And they can use it. And we have people that use part of our standard and not the whole thing. The force here are advertisers. Advertisers are faced with entropy in the measurement marketplace when they go globally. They go to this country and that country and they get different things. And what they want to see is more consistency. So very often what you see are large advertisers say, you know what, we want a common standard. And guess what common standards out there? The MRC standards out there. And we like that, and we're members of the MRC and we participate. So would you guys consider using the MRC standard? Don't mistake that for MRC forcing that. That's not what's going on, but there is a need. There is a need for consistent measurement across countries for global marketers, global agencies, and other practitioners, that measure. For example, Sky, Sky's in multiple countries. Maybe they need a consistent measurement standard to understand how they perform. So that's different than us believing we have jurisdiction everywhere. It's nuanced, but do you understand the point I'm trying to make?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think that
You might not think it's right or wrong, but that's the way
well,
I view the world. That's what we do.
a lot of these things are about the gap between reality and perception, and I think that one of one of the challenges is that, but going back many years, this may have changed. But when I was a research supplier, most of the American companies I dealt with were organized in the sense they had a main organization, which was US, and then they had an overseas bit, as opposed to being an international company that was in many countries. They tended to be organized that the overseas bit was the sidecar to the main business. And I think that one of the perceptional issues may be the fact that however much you've got people participating and having European partners and so on, that at heart, if there's going to be a global international standard, and don't get me wrong, I'm not, it could, no issues with it being the MRC one, but that there is a feeling of co-ownership that goes, I guess what I'm getting at, could you foresee a situation where there is a change in the MRC governance that you sort of, what's the word, you evolve from being a Congress-backed entity set up by Congress to being something that has actually got co-ownership with people in Europe? Because I think this is going to become an issue with the European Media Freedom Act, which we've been talking about ASI a lot, and I'm sure you're very well aware of, that is going to
Yeah.
increase the demand from the European Union for measurement services to be audited, and that auditing is going to require far more common European standards. Otherwise, it's going to be chaos. And whether politically it's going to be acceptable to the EU, particularly given the elephant in the room in the White House at the moment, to accept a standard that's been brought up by a company, however much it's consulted with other countries, that is an American company.
I mean, I think that very well could evolve as a political and operational reality. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. I can tell you a couple of things. One, the MRC would never want to do something that puts our antitrust protection in jeopardy in the US, because that would mean we'd have to cease operations. We couldn't do what we do even in the US if we can't gather our members together to help assess what we do. So no matter what we might consider in terms of ensuring, let's say, fair representation in standard setting, we have to be mindful of not jeopardizing our authority in the US. I'm talking The only place we really have authority is in the US in doing what we do. Um, what the other aspect I'd say, Richard, is maybe you're a tiny bit, with respect, behind the curveball on this one. Like, I think if you've ever heard of this phrase, um, like AGF, some of the organizations I mentioned, Auditel, Sim Belgium, ECTA, the Association of Canadian Advertisers, the WFA, TV Globo in Brazil, SBT, RTL, TF1, ISBA, BARB. These are not places that have US centric operations, and they just like speak lightly to Europe. No, these are everybody I just mentioned. They don't reside in the US, operationally much. And those are members of the MRC that we seek to help and work with, and they participate in standard setting processes as their interests drive. For example, not many of these companies don't participate in auction transparency standard because maybe they don't see that as that relevant to them right at the moment. I think later they will, but did they want to participate in the cross media measurement standard? And when we open that standard up to display, and others, are they going to participate? Heck yes, they are, because they're front and center on. So we've changed in terms of our member composition in some degree, where we have an international committee, we have a European committee, we interact with other organizations, like we've interacted with IAB Europe, we interact informally with CESP, etc. So we're a little bit more global focused than we even were 3 years ago.
Mm.
We haven't changed our governance, to your point. We probably should think about what else we could put in place to promote a perception of fairness and the reality of fairness. But slowly, like, our lives have evolved. And I think it's because of what we do. Like, the standards that we do, some of them really stand on their merit. They're pretty good standards. And, take it, I work with the MRC, so, I'm going to be a little biased in that direction. But many of, like, our invalid traffic and fraud filtration standard, it's the only one that exists in the world. It has GIVT, SIVT. We keep it up to date. It's hard. It's difficult. Who else is doing it? Who else is doing it? It takes a lot of our energy to do that. So that's where we are today. That's the reality. And we have changed a little bit.
Mm. In
Doesn't
terms,
fully answer your question, but what I'm
no,
trying to
no,
get you to understand is, like,
yeah, absolutely. I mean,
evolution taking place.
yeah, and to some degree, as ever, my job is to be devil's advocate. So some of this is me channeling, yeah, other opinions as well as my own. But I guess one of the interesting questions would be the degree to which the audits that you do are linked to those MRC standards. I mean, conceivably, if you were invited to do an audit in a country that was following some other form of standard, would you be able to audit them that they were complying with the standard that had been agreed in that country, or are the two linked in the sense of you're auditing to MRC standards, if you see what I mean?
I do see what you mean. Another good question. First of all, our audits are specifically designed to verify compliance with the provisions of the standard. So they're inextricably linked and, in fact, driven by the content of the standard. So, for example, our standard says, how do you measure an impression? When do you measure an impression? What conditions have to be there? What conditions have to be there for a viewable impression? How do you report it? What metrics do you report around the standard? Our audit goes in and verifies that within the organization being audited. Is that functionality in place? Is it operating? And is it fit for purpose? So we don't just go in and say, are they doing what they say they're doing? Like if they don't measure the impression right and they tell everybody that, we still don't accredit it because it's not in compliance with the standard.
Mm.
So um, we
So
we audit.
it's not just a process audit. It is an actual audit of
Absolutely.
fitness for purpose.
Exactly. So when we audit, like we have a big audit of the Nielsen panel in the US, very big audit, probably the biggest audit we do. It's kind of rivals between what we do at Google and what we do at Nielsen. They're both very big. Um, when we audit the Nielsen panel, we don't just say, well, do they have X number of panelists and they've got a meter installed. We tune those televisions. We follow data through the meter back to the Nielsen home office. We understand that the right things that appeared on the glass of the TV were eventually credited. We look at the representation of the panel. We look at processing, weighting, how data is calculated. If we were just trying to verify that they're doing what they say they're doing, we wouldn't do all those things. We wouldn't talk about, do you have enough Hispanics in your panel in the US? Do you have enough, Black African Americans in your panel in the US? Do you have enough young people? Do you have enough poor people, rich people? Why would we do that? We look at the operating effectiveness of measures and we spend incredible amounts of time at that. So, and when we audit things like ad serving, we test conditions under which ad serving happens. If somebody doesn't accept JavaScript on their PC or whatever, or their mobile phone is jailbroken or whatever, does ad serving still work? So we test effectiveness as well as process. The audit, though, is designed to verify the components of the standard. And when we see things that aren't complied with, we call that out as non-compliance. And a service cannot be accredited if it has a material amount of non-compliance. Multiple material areas of non-compliance, we will not accredit a service. These are very rigorous audit. You mentioned the European Media Freedom Act. We applaud that act. What I hope is that it drives rigor in verification. Requiring audit is one thing. A paper tiger of an audit is more damaging than it's worth. You need to have rigor in these things. And our audits are very rigorous.
It's an interesting point about paper tigers. I like the analogy, but I guess you mentioned rigorous, and certainly in our recent podcast panel, there was a perception that went unchallenged, I guess, that MRC audits were, by their very nature, an expensive process. I mean, how would you counter that perception, which I have to say is quite common? And this is a very old viewpoint, but when I first entered panel-based media research in 20 years ago, I was told by a few people that, oh, well, the MRC is quite convenient for Nielsen and Arbitron because it's a barrier to entry to anyone else in the US because no one could possibly afford to have a full TV measurement or radio measurement system audited. I'm sure you're going to tell me that's an out-of-date view, but I guess the trouble is you're not going to tell me how much an audit costs. But how would you challenge that perception that the rigorousness of the audits, and also I think was referenced in the podcast, the duration of the audits? So I think someone mentioned audits taking years rather than months potentially. How would you counter that viewpoint? I assumed you would counter it, but
Well, one thing I'm not going to counter is that an MRC audit is not inexpensive. So it's not cheap to be colloquial. It's not cheap to be accredited. It depends on how you look at it, Richard. When we audit an organization, there are certain forcing functions that we have. Most of the organizations we audit end up having an internal audit function to do similar things that we do on an ongoing basis because we're not there auditing every day. And companies want to make sure they still are compliant over time. Now, would you say that's an audit cost, or is that just a cost of being accurate for your customers? What about software quality assurance? When you maintain software, should you be testing it before you put it in production? Should you make sure it works? We require that as part of an MRC audit. Is that good business, or is that just a cost of being MRC accredited? What about data ingestion? If you're gonna ingest big data, you need to monitor it to make sure you know all the fields continue to exist and they're defined the same way, that it's being edited properly and cleaned properly. Is that just a cost of MRC, or is that a cost of doing business properly? Depending on how you look at things, I was speaking to a man yesterday from an auditee who said, I have 20 people who just work on MRC things. And I said, well, hold on a minute. Are some of, I'm thinking to myself, some of those people are internal audit people. Some of those people are software people. Some of those people are quality assurance people. Those people are necessary to serve your customers accurately. They're also necessary to demonstrate to us that you're in compliance. What drives what? So an audit can be expensive, and it's the CPA costs. But as quoted on your podcast, somebody was saying, well, these audits are like 8 figures. We've never executed an 8 figure audit in our entire history, never even close to that. But if you embed the entire cost of doing business in a quality manner into your MRC function, well, yeah, maybe it is an 8 figure audit if you're a big company. So there's a tension there. Our audits are generally, like, for a good sized company, they might be several $100,000. You said I wouldn't quote audit costs. I'm giving you a general sense. For a good sized company, it probably costs you several $100,000 to get audited and accredited. For a very big enterprise, it might cost $1 million, or it might cost a little bit more if you have highly manual processes. So this is a very key point. The more automated a process is, it's counterintuitive, but at a certain level, it's easier to audit. It gets executed the same way every time. There are processing rules. We can look at them. We can review code. We can test them. If you got a lot of people involved, we got people running out to households, installing meters. We got people maintaining meters. We got people going out recruiting panelists. You worked in the panel area. We got to maintain meters. We then got to edit this data, make sure it's flowing right. Guess what, Richard? That's a very challenging process to audit, because guess what? People make a lot of mistakes. So we have to take samples, we have to look at field work, we have to look at meter installation, we have to look at recruitment processes, because those aren't all executed the same way. They're executed by humans. So that drives audit costs. And you mentioned timing. The first time we audited Google search, we audited that in a calendar quarter, and you can't imagine how big that is.
Mm.
The Nielsen audit takes months to execute because of everything we have to do to verify a lot of human processes in the middle of that. So there are parameters. What drives audit costs are people and human processes and human intervention in processes and humans being able to get into data and change it and things like that. That we have to look at intensely. When there's automated processes, we can test that fairly efficiently. But it's true, we have to use CPAs to do our audits. They bring independence,
So
standards of
can I
field work.
clarify? Can I clarify
Yeah.
CPA? That's CPA
That's a
stands.
certified public accountant or a chartered accountant.
Yeah.
When we were formed, Richard, by the US government, one of the things in our charter, driven by our government heritage, is that we must use an independent CPA as the basis of our audit process. Not unlike if you're a public company, you can't just have any Yahoo come in and do your financial audit and submit it to the regulators. You have to have a chartered accountant or a CPA firm do that. The government has that same thing instilled in our process. we have to use independent CPAs as the basis of our process when we were formed. We have people come to us every day, consultants, all kinds of companies say, we'd like to do an MRC audit for you. And we can't. We might be able to use them as an expert in the middle of a process for a sub process, but overall our audits must be conducted by independent CPA. That drives rigor because they have to form an opinion, and it drives a certain level of quality too.
Presumably that applies to the US. If you were doing an audit outside of the US, you wouldn't necessarily have that restriction, would you?
It hasn't been tested. We've been asked that question many times, but our legal counsel says, why would you ever even take the chance of putting yourself in jeopardy? So just use CPAs to the extent they exist in countries, try to use them. What we have seen is, we have to understand the business environment in countries and everything. And very often there are local practitioners that might be influential in our audit process and the formation of it that we might be able to use for sub processes. Like we're speaking to certain organizations that may want to participate in our international audits at a certain level on certain specialized areas. And we're open to that. But overall, our legal counsel says, you know what you should do? You should make sure that on a macro basis, this still is basically a CPA audit. And again, I'm using CPA, that's an American term, but
Yeah.
most countries, that concept,
Yeah.
like a chartered accountant or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. And finally, I'm conscious of your time. One of the comments that was made on the podcast, which I have to confess I didn't quite understand, so perhaps we can unpack it together, rather, is that, and it was in the context of the new US JIC system that is not like any JIC system Europeans would recognise, but is effectively seems to be a way of approving vendors. It was said in a critical way that the MRC isn't approving usability of the data, that somehow it's only in inverted commas appraising the quality of it. What is that something that you've come across as an argument, that somehow you can approve the usability of data in a quicker, more streamlined way that isn't as in depth of what you're doing? What do they mean by usability, do you think? I should have asked them at the time. I think it was Leslie Wood who mentioned that.
Yeah, well, one thing I have to confess is I'm not, even probably compared to Leslie, I'm not an expert at the US JIC operations. I don't participate in the JIC. I'm not a part of the JIC. But my understanding, Richard, which others, who are better informed might challenge, but my understanding is that the JIC is looking at certain characteristics that these measurement services have that would enable them to receive, let's say data from sell side organizations. Like if I'm making this up,
Hmm.
hypothetical, if I'm NBC in the US, let's say, and and I have first party data, my streaming data, etc., and I'm trying to figure out whether I should give that to a measurement service because everybody wants it to use it in their measurement process. I want to make sure that there are certain processes and controls over that data because if it's my first party data, I'm ultimately held responsible for the confidentiality of that data and for the downstream processing of that data. So the JIC has enabled processes to qualify measurement services for the receipt of data, the trust of that, and the interoperability of that data transfer. That's what I believe has happened so far. And it might be more involved in that, but that's the big picture from my perspective
Yeah.
of what's going on. We don't do that. We really don't, but we look at the quality and transparency of the measurement process that the vendors execute once they get that data.
Hmm.
And the JIC, I think, wants to move into that area. but what I've been told is they would never move into it with the same level of rigor and depth as we do it, because we're ultimately the accrediting body for, the research that's reported. But
Mm,
and there was even we participated with the JIC, even though it was on JIC letterhead. I think I'm quoted in a a, a document that the JIC put out trying to clarify roles of the two organizations.
mm.
Um, and
Yeah, I
but
think I
that's
saw.
my view.
Yeah, I think I saw that document. I think it is obviously going to be really important in the US for data users to understand that there is a big difference between JIC certification and MRC accreditation. That then one isn't just a shortcut for the other. But
I think we do different things. Um, but you're not going to hear like JIC bashing from me. I don't do that. And I actually believe in a lot of the things that the JIC is trying to accomplish. Like to release that data from NBC, keeping with that hypothetical example, and have it carry forward to the measurement enterprises. If there's a JIC mechanism that can be set up to do that and qualify that and make sure that's done appropriately, man, I'd applaud that, because ultimately what that will do is release more data into the marketplace that's deeper. And we all know our problem right now is lack of data, And our problem too is that things like privacy, which is a noble thing that we need to promote, is also creating loss of signal. So we need to figure out ways to have more data flowing through the system, more competent data, not less. And if the JIC can help with that, I'm all behind it.
sounds like a good point to end on. Thanks for explaining so clearly in a fascinating way how the MRC fits into everything. There's many moving parts in this, and a lot of those moving parts will be covered at the ASI conference that's coming up in Copenhagen in November. Hopefully, in the next few weeks, we'll be issuing details on how people can book for that, and hopefully, we can persuade George to be there as well to take part in that debate, because many of the companies you mentioned that are now affiliated with the MRC will be there. So I'm sure they'd be fascinated here to discuss this more.
Yeah, and it's in my travel plans actually, so I'm looking
Excellent.
forward to being there one way or another.
Excellent. Well, thanks for your time, George.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. I appreciate it. Great questions. Thank you.